Hi and welcome to How and Why with me, Phil Cohen. For this video I want to look at temple offerings. I don't want to go into too much detail because if you do you end up getting very complicated and looking at lots of different processes that were undertaken. On the other hand, I don't want to get too high level and look at the whole issue of animal sacrifices because that's really not what I want to get into. What I want to look at is the broad processes that one went through that were common to all offerings that were brought. To begin with, let's go through the four main components of a temple offering. Firstly, there was the animal itself, which would usually be an ox, a ram, a sheep or a goat, but could be, in some cases, a turtle dove or a pigeon if a bird offering was being brought. There would be an accompanying meal offering, and we'll talk about those later on in the video. But before either of those were put on the Mizbeach, on the altar, they had to have salt added to them. That's the third component. And that would be also accompanied by a libation, which would usually be wine, but on the one exception, on Sukkot, that would be the wine would be replaced for water. We'll start with the animal components of the offering. There were three stages of preparation that had to be undertaken on the animal before it was ready to be handed over to the Kohen. Firstly, the animal had to be designated for the particular purpose of that sacrifice. This stage of consecration is called hektish in Hebrew. And it was important to get this right because you can envisage someone coming to the temple with a variety of different offerings for a variety of different purposes. And it was important to get right which animal was for which sacrifice. Next, the animal was brought into an area of the temple you can see here called the Azorah. This was a courtyard in which Kohanim and non-Kohens could enter. But you had to be in a state of spiritual purity called tahara. You couldn't be what's called tomei to come into this part. And that was often a restriction that would prevent people from coming in here. Once the owner is in the courtyard of the temple with the animals, they do samicha. They put their body weight, their hands and their body weight on the head of the animal and declare the purpose of the animal and what it's being brought for, and undertake a vidui, a confession, if it's a chatas, for lack of a better word, a sin offering, for something somewhere where they've fallen short, they've made a mistake. That would be done with the Kohen, of course, in complete confidence. Once the owner has done samicha on the animal, it is ready to undergo the four-stage process of the actual avoda, the actual service that was undertaken, mostly by the Kohen. Firstly, the animal would undergo shechita, in the same way that animals are shechted today. Once the animal has been shechted, blood will squirt out from the animal's neck, and that is collected in a specially designated gold round-bottomed bowl. The process of receiving that blood is called Kabbalah, which literally means receiving. It has a round bottom so that it's not put down. The reason being is that the Kohen receiving the blood swirls it in their palm to stop it from coagulating, from clotting. This blood is then transferred across to the position of the altar. That third stage of the process is called halacha, which literally means travelling or going. Finally, the blood is applied to the altar, or sprinkled on the altar, or daubed on the altar, depending on the type of sacrifice it is, and we'll come on to that in a minute. And that process is called zerika, which literally means sprinkling. Now that is the critical part of the avoda, of the service for this particular offering, and that absolutely had to be done by a Kohen. And once that had been done, that sort of marked a main milestone in the bringing of the offering. After the zerika, what happens next very much depends on the type of offering being brought. But we have a principle that only meat that is fit for human consumption can be consumed, if you like, on the altar. And so, for example, only kosher animals can be brought as animal offerings. But also we have a principle of Gid Hanoshe, the sciatic nerve, that cannot be eaten by humans and is removed from the animal before it is eaten or before it is offered up on the altar. It goes back to the struggle between Jacob and the angel. So that has to be removed, even from sacrifices that are completely burnt on the altar. In addition, any meat that goes onto the altar needs to be salted first. If the sacrifice is not being completely burnt, the amurim are removed. These are the visceral fats around the internal organs, the liver and the diaphragm and the kidneys. And those are salted and burnt on the altar. Broadly speaking, there are 4 different types of offerings that can be brought. Each one has many subcategories, and if you look at a decent chumash like the Art Scroll Chumoshim, it'll give all the different types and all the different circumstances under which these offerings are brought. But let's stick to these broad categories. Firstly, the ola, which is completely burnt. We've just mentioned it. This is brought under a range of circumstances, and the type of animal that is brought depends on the circumstances involved. But in all cases, it's slaughtered in the northern side of the courtyard, and the blood is applied to the northeast and southwestern corners and the lower part of the outer altar. The meal offering that's brought with that, as we will come on to in a moment, is a minchas nesochim in Hebrew, or a libation meal offering. The second category is called a chatas. This is loosely translated as being a sin offering. And there were a broad range of circumstances under which one would have to bring such an offering. Most likely, though, was for inadvertently committing an aveira for which a specific type of punishments would be incurred if one had committed that aveira intentionally. It was slaughtered in the same place, in the northern part of the courtyard, and the blood is applied to all 4 corners of the mizbeach, of the altar. The meal offering that accompanies a chatas depends on the reasons for chatas being brought in the first place. The third category is called an osham. Now, the Art Scroll Chumash and Siddur translates this as a guilt offering. It's a bit of a ragbag. And if you look in the Mishnah Zevachim, in the 5th chapter, the 5th Mishnah, we read it every day as part of the Ezehu Makomo. It lists the different types of ashamas that would need to be brought. The 4th category of offering is the shlomim. A shlomim could be brought out of the kindness of your heart, because you just wanted to bring an offering to the temple. It was processed, as you can see, in the regular way, and accompanied by a minchas nesochim, a libation meal offering. The meat of the animal, however, was split 3 ways. The amurim, the visceral fats, the diaphragm, the liver, and the kidneys, were dissected out, salted, and offered on the altar. The right thigh and the breast were waved with the owner. Well, the owner helped the Kohen wave them in front of the altar, and they were given to the Kohen to eat. The rest of the shlomim was for the owner to eat. A subcategory of the shlomim is the Thanksgiving offering, the Todah. This had many similarities with a shlomim, but one important difference was that the mincha, the meal offering that was brought along with it, was a lot more complicated. It consisted of 4 different types of loaves, for lack of a better word, and they were baked in 4 different ways. And for each of those 4 types, you brought 10 of each type. Meal offerings are a little bit more complicated than the animal component of the sacrifice, in that they could be brought as a separate entity in their own right, as a separate sacrifice. But broadly speaking, the process one would go through for all types of meal offerings would be roughly the same. And in fact, the process that one goes through for an animal sacrifice has many parallels, as we'll see, with that of a meal offering. The first three steps, parallel with the first three steps of bringing an animal sacrifice, start with making hektish, consecrating the ingredients one's going to use for the meal offering. And this would typically be wheat flour and olive oil. Obviously in the temple they would have, they wouldn't be using McDougall's, they'd be using their own specially designated finely ground flour, Menachos Solus it was called, and they would have extra virgin olive oil, the best they could get. Most of the time, most meal offerings involved wheat flour, but there were two that involved barley, and that was the Omer offering that was brought on the second day of Pesach to mark the start of the barley harvest festival, barley harvest season, as you'd expect. And the meal offering brought by a sota, by a suspected adulteress, but we'll keep that as exceptions. After the ingredients had been consecrated, had been made hektish, a little bit of oil would be put into a mixing bowl, and in the temple they would have designated gold mixing bowls for this purpose. They wouldn't be using my wife's finest Pyrex mixing bowl. You then add the flour, and then add some of the oil, or maybe all of the oil, as we'll see. We then split off into three different categories of meal offering. One, as I say, could bring one of 5 different types of voluntary meal offering, just because one wanted to, and they could be pan fried, shallow fried, oven baked, but one would have to designate which one one wanted to bring. A shallow fried one would perhaps look a bit more like matzah, as we have here. Perhaps more deeper fried would end up being like this pita bread, perhaps. And then you could go for full-on bread, loaves, challah that were baked in an oven. If one wanted to designate one of these 5 types of baked or fried sacrifices, one would also add in some water and mix it up into a sort of gooey mush. If one wanted to just keep it as a flour sacrifice, as a plain flour sacrifice, a third application of oil would be made, and one would divide the oil one was going to use into three lots for that. That third stage, that third application of oil, in Hebrew is called yatzika, which means just pouring. If one was bringing this meal offering as part of a Menachos Nesachim, a libation offering, seen on the table here in sort of orangey brown, they would also follow the same process for bringing a plain meal offering and add that third pouring of oil and have yatzika there. Finally, the mixture was brought to the southwest corner of the outer altar in the temple or the tabernacle and given over to the Kohen. This process is called Hagosha. Once the meal offering was with the Kohen, what happened next very much depended on whether it was a voluntary meal offering or whether it was a Menachos Nesachim, one of the libation meal offerings. A libation meal offering would in its entirety be salted and burnt on the altar. For a voluntary meal offering, it doesn't matter whether it was a flour offering or whether it had been baked or fried or whatever it was, the Kohen would take a scoop with their 3 middle fingers of the offering called a kamitza. It had to be exactly that measure, and the Kohen could use his sort of thumb and little finger to to sort of level it off. But this required a great deal of dexterity. Remember, this could be wafers that one was crushing in one's fingers, or it could be flour that could easily sprinkle away. So that kamitza was then transferred to a secondary vessel, and that vessel, that was then salted and then haktorah, burnt on the altar. The leftovers, called shirayim, were then free for the Kohen to eat in whichever way they saw fit. Along with the meal offering, as it was being burnt on the mizbeach, on the altar, a libation would be poured of wine, good old power number 10 or whatever it is they had. This would only be, though, for the voluntary meal offerings that we've said, and for an olah or for a shalomim, not for a chatas. It wasn't really appropriate for wine to be poured when someone's fallen short of expectations. Well, that's it. Well, look, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it helpful.